Welcome to our study this week in our Fulton Bible Institute. Here we are in lesson 2 of our spring semester. We are continuing our study of the Old Testament, looking at various books. Tonight we are going to look at the book of Psalms. When you take most English translations of the Bible and you were to open that to the middle of that Bible, you will find that the Psalms will be situated directly in the middle, and it eats up that space of being in the middle of most of our Bibles, somewhere in the Psalms. And what's interesting about the Psalms and that fills that part is that sort of is symbolic for what the Psalms are in the Scripture, in that the Psalms are really the heart of Scripture. They are the heart of Old Testament worship. They are the heart of our New Testament as well. They're part of the heart of our New Testament devotion. They give us ideas of what it means to be devoted and worshiping God. And so tonight we're going to spend a little time looking at that book. Now, again, we have studied this book in this class before. If you remember, a few years ago, 2 years ago, when I first took over this class, we began studying the book of Psalms, and we took 2 semesters to look at the book of Psalms, and we did a pretty good in-depth study, and we saw just how different the book of Psalms is from other books. And we're going to take that idea and sort of try to break it down into one lesson tonight and sort of give us, again, an overview and hopefully a reminder of some of the stuff we studied in that book in that time. The Psalms are the most widely used book in the Bible. It's the most widely quoted, the most widely used. It's used in the Old Testament. It's used in the New Testament. Matter of fact, it is the most quoted book in the New Testament, more than any other. There are many quotes from the Psalms. Jesus himself, meantime, will speak of the Psalms, and they're speaking of him, and they're speaking of the coming Messiah. And so that's one of the roles the Psalms would have had. The other role the Psalms would have had, in that the Psalm basically means praise. It means praises. And so the Psalms are books or poems about praising. And they're praising God and praising God for what he's done and what he's going to do. The Psalms is a collection of poems, hymns, and prayers that serve as a devotional guide to express praise and adoration to God. They are a collection of poems that were written to God, to worship God. Now, this is the interesting thing about the book of Psalms is that the book of Psalms is typically, when we look at our Bible, when we look at the books of the Bible, those books were books that God inspired and God had man write for man. They're God's way of speaking and telling man what he would have man to do. When you get to the Psalms, it's sort of the flip of that, in that it's not God speaking to man, but is a recording, a record of man speaking to God. And so that's the interesting thing about the Psalms. And again, this doesn't mean they're not inspired, doesn't mean they're not valuable. It means that they are an idea of how we should praise and give us ideas and thoughts of how we can praise and how we can serve God. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight as we study this great book. The Psalms have many authors. We've talked about that in all of our books about who we think the author is. The Psalms there's various authors for various Psalms. Matter of fact, we go through the subscriptions, the ascriptions at the top, the inscription, at the top of the Psalms. They have been attributed to various people. The list is on the screen in front of you. There are about 75 Psalms that have been credited to David. That's over half the book. The sons of Korah, a singing group of the Levites, a Levitical priesthood singing group that had a part in the temple. They wrote 10 to 12 of the Psalms. Asaph, another singing family of Levites that was used in worship, wrote 12 of them. We also have Solomon is recorded as writing 2 of these. Heman and Ethan are both described as writing 1. These were men who lived during the time of David and Solomon. And then you have Moses as being attributed to writing 1 of these Psalms. So these Psalms come from various time period and various places and various authors. And again, there's some of the Psalms we have no clue who wrote them. We don't even have any good guesses of who may have wrote those Psalms. And so we have this recording of people's poems that were written in worship to God. But although we may not know all the authors, we do know about the Psalms. Well, there are some things we can learn about the Psalms. And so we see that, again, there are about 50 of these that are anonymous. 50 of these that don't have any inscription telling us who the author is. Some think that Ezra may have wrote some of these, but again, that's an educated guess. These books, these Psalms, are written individually, and then over time they were collected together, and as they were collected together, they were put into books. Matter of fact, if you look at the Psalms, there's actually 5 books of Psalms. There are books that are gathered together with 5 divisions that are very important, and we'll talk about those in just a minute, what they are. Some have seen these 5 divisions of Psalms correspond with the 5 books of law, and these 5 books of Psalms correlate with the 5 books of Torah. Again, the Jews had symbolism in numbers, so there was 5 and 5. Each psalm period begins with a general introductory chapter, a general introduction of what a psalm is, or what that book is about, or that section is about, that book is about, and how you can live for God in that section. Now, let's look at these ideas. Book 1 covers from Psalm 1 through Psalm 41. This book is primarily accredited to David. Nearly every psalm says accredited to David wrote it. And David has written these books to deal with the realization of God's presence. The first 41 psalms deal with God's presence, God being there, God being here, God living, and what God is doing. The next book, book 2, takes from Psalm 42 through Psalm 72. These books were written again primarily by David, but also by Korah, and they reflect praise and thanksgiving to God. These were songs written to God to praise Him, to thank Him for all He's done. Book 3 is Psalm 79 or 73 through 89. These are attributed again to Asaph. They recognize our personal need to commune with God, our personal need to communicate, our personal need to have a relationship with God. And so this is where the focus of that book is. Book 4, this covers Psalm 90 to Psalm 106. These are anonymous psalms. However, they reflect God's part in our history. These psalms will talk about God's work through history, about God's work through Israel, God's work through Abraham. One of these psalms will talk about the deliverance of God, how God worked from Egypt all the way forward to the kings. And it's very beautiful psalms, and these psalms talk about the history of Israel and our spiritual history. And then finally, the 5th book is Psalm 107 to Psalm 150. Some of these are David's. Most are anonymous. These share a sense of deliverance by the Almighty from our enemies. The idea that there was a deliverance. And some of these psalms have even been thought to have been written possibly at the time of, again, Ezra, the time of after the Babylonian captivity and after the return. And so what we see is a large stretch of time that the Psalms have been collected, because you have some Psalms by David, and then you have the Psalm by Moses. Psalm by Moses falls into book 4, if I remember correctly, in that it falls into those books of the history of God. But you have these Psalms that begin with David and go, again, probably to Ezra. If not Ezra wrote them, then Ezra's time, because there's references or sounds like the returning from captivity. And these Psalms are written by various people, and these Psalms were collected over time, and then they were finally composed into these books. They were composed together to make up the book of Psalms that we have, in these books of Psalms that we're looking at tonight, or that we've looked at. Now we're not going to go into more detail about this, but we're just wanting to give you an idea of what these books were. Now, the next part about the Hebrew Bible that I want us to talk about, this is a part that we sometimes get lost in. And I know the last time when we talked about the Psalms, this was a hard thing to grasp because this is not something we're used to, because Psalms are poetry. The psalmists are Psalms are poems. And I was reading today about getting ready for this class. The difference between, one of the problems English writers have, or readers have, is that Hebrew poetry was not necessarily about rhyming words, but of rhyming thought, of matching a thought, not a word. And so that's sort of odd. When we talk about parallel, we talk about rhyme, we talk about being the same thing. We think that it ought to be sound the same. Not necessarily true. That they want to do is get a point across. The parallelism, and all these parallelisms we're going to talk about 5 or 6, I think, are going to be about an emphasis. They're going to have a purpose to them. Well, let's notice these. The first one is called synonymous parallelism. This is the second line reinforces the thought of the first. You notice on the screen for you, Psalm 19:1. There's also Psalm 51:2 and various other places talk about this. But Psalm 19:1 says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above His handiwork." Now notice, the heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims his handiwork. That is a continuation of that thought. It is a reinforcement of that thought of God. Again, those first one, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies, well, the skies parallel with heavens. Proclaims, parallels with declare. And then his handiwork declares, coincides, parallels with the glory of God. So here you have this parallelism where it repeats basically the thought, but it's repeated for the idea of making a point, for teaching a lesson. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Again, to us, and when we think about prose writing, this sounds redundant. This doesn't make sense. But in poetry, this is common. This is repeating the idea. So there are going to be times when the psalmist is going to sound like he's repeating himself, and he's doing that with a purpose. He's wanting us to catch the point. That this parallelism happens so that we can learn and we can see and know about what is going on and what is happening with the psalmist. Now, the next kind of parallelism we're going to talk about is going to be antithetical parallelism. This is where the second line emphasizes the first by stating a contrasting thought. Now, this can be seen in Psalms 1:6, Psalm 30, verse 5, Psalm 37, verses 21 and 22. Again, on the screen before you, Psalm 1:6. Psalm 1:6 says, "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." Now notice, this is a parallelism where the second line emphasizes the first by giving a contrasting thought. Well, what contrasting thought? Well, let's break this down. Notice the first line talks about the way of the righteous. The way of the righteous. The Lord knows the ways of the righteous. And so that gives comfort. And to give it even more comfort is to realize the opposition to that. That is the way of the wicked. The way of the wicked will perish. Well, the first line and second line have different points, have different ideas, but the second line emphasizes the first one in that it emphasizes the way of the righteous is where the Lord knows, is where we want to be, is where you want to be. You want to be where God knows you, where God's approving and God's all for you, versus being against God, the way of the wicked. And so the psalmist will use this style of writing. He'll use this style where they will not necessarily contradict, but contrast, use two different ideas, the way of the righteous versus the way of the wicked. And they give both in very important, very key points and very key ideas of the writing. And Psalm 1 is a very interesting psalm, and we'll do this little side note real quick. Psalm 1 is sort of an introduction to this entire book. Psalm 1 talks about the way of the righteous, of what the righteous ought to do, of how the righteous can be like a tree by rivers of water that soak it up and are producing fruit in every season. And then it ends with this idea that you have a choice. And this is sort of the concept, this is sort of the idea that the Bible gives and the Psalms themselves give, is that every one of us has a choice. We have a choice either to follow and go the way of the righteous, the way that God knows, or we have a choice to go the way of the wicked, which leads to punishment or leads to perishment, leads to destruction. And so the psalmist here gives this idea of antithetical parallelism in that he emphasizes the thought of the first by contrasting it with the thought of the second. You've got these two paths, the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked. Well, which one are you going to choose? Well, if you choose easily, you want the way of the righteous. Why? Because it's the more desired path. And so this is where antithetical parallelism comes into play. The next parallelism we're going to look at is synthetic parallelism. This is where the thought of the first line is extended and made complete by the second. The first thought goes and finishes the thought of extends it and finishes it. Notice, again, this is Psalm 9:10, Psalm 19, 7 through 10, Psalm 25, 8 through 10, and so forth. Psalm 9, verse 10 says this, and those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Again, notice this parallel. For those who know your name, put their trust in you. The ones who know the name, your name, the name of God. Then he goes on to say, for you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. And again, it completes the thought. Why do they trust in you? Why should we trust in you is the idea here. Why should we be worried about the name of God? And why should we be worried about obeying him? Why should we be worried about him being our God? Well, because God will not forsake us. God will not leave us. God will stay with us as long as we strive to stay true to him, as long as we live for him and do what he's called us to do. So again, this is another way of parallelism that emphasizes an important fact, emphasizes an important idea of what the psalmist is trying to teach us. The next is climactic parallelism. Climactic parallelism is where the second line repeats part of the first line and then adds a new thought. This is seen in Psalm 77:1, Psalm 94:1, Psalm 96:7. Let's look at Psalm 77:1. Psalm 77:1, I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. Again, the psalmist says, I cry aloud. I cry. Cry to who? To God. And I cry aloud to God. I cry aloud, and so God can hear me. And then you notice he continues that thought, I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. And he completes that thought. Again, he adds a new thought, Not does he just cry to God, but he cries to God because he knows God hears him. He knows that God will respond, that God will acknowledge, and God is listening for him. Very important concept, very important idea, and this is that climactic. Again, you see these psalms, and most Bibles will divide these psalms into lines, and that's why you'll notice some books of psalms you'll have a little words, and you have a longer word underneath it. It's because it's divided into parallel lines, and these are very important. So when you read the psalms, pay attention to these verses, pay attention to these words, and see if you can notice some of these parallelism. Then finally, we have the last one. That was the last one. Finally, we go into our last little part of this lesson for tonight, and that is to talk about the classifications of Psalms. Again, Psalms can be limited or wrote in various ways. When we talk about the Psalms here, we're going to try to talk about some ways these Psalms have been categorized. This is not an exhaustive, complete list. Some of these Psalms are going to fit in 2 or 3 different forms. There's really nothing, this is the way they work. But for the most part, this is a way of looking at Psalms. And this is sort of where our class went a few years ago. He talked about all these different types of Psalms, and then we talked about some Psalms that fit into those. One of the most common Psalms in the Old Testament, our type of Psalm, classification of Psalm, is the lament Psalm. This is where there is a plea for deliverance or defense addressed directly to God. This is where the psalmist cries out to God. The psalmist is in terrible straits. He's in a horrible situation, and the only one who can save him is God. And he cries to God to save him. And again, you notice on the screen in front of you and on your notes, there are 2 different lists here. There's the individual crying out to God, but then there's also a national crying out to God, where the nation of Israel itself bows itself and cries to God to save them, or cries for God to act on their behalf. And so this is a very important type of psalm. When the psalmist has very, very down days, very hard times, he has these lament psalms where he cries out to God for God's care and God's concern, because God's the only one who can give him what he needs. We go from there to our next classification of psalms, and that is psalms of confidence. There are these Psalms of confidence. Now, the Psalms of confidence are very interesting because they are very close to the Psalms of lament, except they have an extra part to them. What they do actually is the first part of these Psalms include a lament. They include a cry out to God for deliverance. God save me. God do something. But at the end, it has the idea of peace, security, joy, and confidence. There is a stating that not that God has saved them, but God will save them. That there is a belief that God will step forward, God will act, and God will bring forth this end that they so richly desire. And so they speak this. And again, these Psalms of confidence are given not just on an individual level, of individuals crying out to God for deliverance and knowing God will do it, but there's also a national level of these. And again, for sake of time, we're not going to be able to read these, but if you have time, go back and read some of these Psalms. Take your Bible and pause the video as we go through it and read one of these Psalms just to get a good idea of what these Psalms are about. We continue from there to talk about Psalms of thanksgiving. These Psalms of thanksgiving are psalms written to express public thanksgiving for what God has done or in anticipation for what God will do. These psalms are very interesting, and because they give thanks to God, they thank God for being God, for what He's done. And these psalms are written as public. This is public idea of what God has done for them, and praising God for saving them, praising God for what He has done for them, and how He has brought them deliverance, and how He's brought them blessings. And even some of these psalms, as we said, the second part, what's interesting about these, some of these psalms are written not from the standpoint that God has already acted, but that God will act. And there was no question that God will save us. God will deliver us. God will redeem us if we stay true and stay fully in Him. And again, these psalms of thanksgiving are seen on an individual level of how individuals speak of how God has delivered them personally. And there's also psalms written on a national level of how God has saved the nation of Israel, how God saved the people of Israel from their sin. Or from various things, not necessarily saving, but thanksgiving for what God has done. Blessings of blessing them as a nation. From there, we go to our psalms of praise. There are certain psalms that were written as psalms of praise. Psalms of praise for God. And typically these psalms are written with three key elements. There are three parts to these psalms. Number one, there is a call to praise. A call to praise or introduction. Second, there is a cause for praise, typically one of God's attributes or one of God's deeds. And then finally, there's a conclusion of why God should be praised. And so there's this call of all to come to praise and all to come to worship God. And then why? Well, because He is the creator. He is the sustainer. He is almighty. He is omnipotent. He is omniscient. He is omnipresent. Any of those big words. Anything that describes God's being, God's mercy, God's grace. We should praise God for that. And then there's this conclusion to this praise. And again, you see these psalms listed as different psalms of praise. Psalms, again, written that were praise to God. And some of these psalms are actually some psalms that are used in songs that we still sing today. Next there are certain enthronement psalms of the divine kingdom. These contain the expression, the Lord reigns, and speak of the rule of God over all the earth, and they are prophetic of Christ's kingly rule. You see the few psalms that fall in this category listed at bottom. These are psalms that speak of God reigning, God being in control. Again, not just in control of Israel and reigning in the nation of Israel, but God reigning in all the earth. God reigning over all the earth, over all the people, and over all things and all times. And there are prophetic ideas. There are foreshadowing of what's coming in the New Testament, of what's coming when Christ comes, of how He will establish His kingdom and what His kingdom will be like. So the Psalms will have this messianic theme to them in their enthronement psalm. There's some enthronement psalms, and that leads us into our next group, I think it is. No, maybe it's a couple more psalms. Oh, hit too many buttons. Apologize for that. There are also messianic psalms, and we'll talk about those, I think, in just a few minutes. But after the enthronement psalms, there are the songs of Zion. These are songs that extol Zion or Jerusalem. They praise Zion. They give thanks to God for that great city and how great that city is. And is extolled because its exalted role as the abode of God's glory and as a religious and political capital of the nation. Because Jerusalem was chosen as God's kingdom, or God's capital by God at a later time, and where God chose to build His temple, the nation of Jerusalem is exalted, it is praised, it is extolled for what a great place it is, and how God has blessed it, and how God has blessed the people there, and how great the people are to be able to go to that city. And so you have these songs of Zion that focus on the city of Jerusalem. From there we have the royal psalms. These are psalms that concern the reign of the king, either historical or messianic or both. These are some of the psalms that they can get a little tricky to us. One example, Psalms 2. Psalm 2 will talk about the reign of the king. And there's hints in that psalm that deal with the present reigning king, but it also deals with the future reigning king, the Messiah. And so these royal psalms contain these ideas that they're praise for a king. And most of these psalms, if I remember correctly, have some messianic tones in them, that they speak of the coming king, the king that's going to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so you have these royal psalms that are written about these kings and about their obedience. Again, Psalm 2 is one of those, and Psalm 2 is sometimes viewed as a double door into the book of Psalms, because Psalm 1 talks about the lifestyle of obeying God and being a righteous person, where Psalm 2 talks about God's king and God's kingdom, of what that king and that kingdom will accomplish and what it will get done. From there, we get into the wisdom psalms. The wisdom psalms are, again, part of the wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is literature written to help us learn wisdom. And the idea of wisdom is not just knowing facts and knowing things, but wisdom is knowing what to do and then doing it. So the wisdom psalms, those here, emphasizes the traditional teachings of the wise men of Israel. This is what they teach: meditation upon the law, the way of the righteous versus the way of the wicked, and the necessity of practical righteousness. They basically falls into those ideas. Again, meditation upon the law, to know God's law, to study God's law. If you study God's law, then you know how to obey it, you know how to follow it, and you'll be faithful to it. Such as Psalm 1 talks about the way of the righteous versus the way of the wicked. How the righteous is different than the wicked. Remember, we read earlier about one of the parallelisms of that verse. In verse 9, the contrasting thought about God knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. That whole psalm is about the way of the wicked and the way of the righteous, and choosing which path you're going to walk. And that's sort of the idea of these wisdom psalms, is choosing which way to go and following that path, whichever way it is. The next type of psalm that we're going to look at, our next group, are historical psalms. There are typically two categorized just as historical. There's a few others that are historical as well as other things. And what these psalms do is they trace the history of God's saving activity on behalf of Israel. They trace what God has done. Some of these psalms trace all the way back to the Exodus. And they trace about God's actions in the 10 plagues. They trace God's action in the Red Sea and all those things that happened. And these psalms are used to remember or to remind God's people what God did. And if God did that then God can do it again. If God saved Israel at that time, God can save his people again. He can deliver them, and he will deliver them if they'll stay true and faithful to him. Then there's the Messianic Psalms. These are psalms that are prophetic of the Messiah in some way. These are psalms, again, that talk about the coming Messiah, the chosen one, the anointed one. A few of these examples. The righteous man's experience foreshadows Christ's experience in Psalm 22. Again, if you were in that class, you remember Psalm 22, he talked about this. If you haven't, it's a very interesting psalm because it talks about a righteous man's pain, about what has happened to him. And what happens to the righteous man is a foreshadowing of what happens to Christ. Because you remember even this psalm, when Christ is on the cross, remember he cries out, the only Hebrew recording we have the Hebrew words we have in the Gospels, where he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is a quote from Psalm 22:1. And again, some people think that what Christ may have done there is actually quoted that entire psalm. He may have cried that entire psalm from the cross. We don't know. There's sometimes people will do this. They'll give a little snippet, a little bit of detail about what they're, a little part of a verse implying that you know the whole psalm. Psalm 2, 4, and 5 talk about the existing king's ideas and calling will be fulfilled in the Christ. That the existing king, what he's doing, what he needs to do, and what God would have him to do is fulfilled fully when Christ comes, when Christ's kingdom comes into place. Christ's work is prophesied in Psalm 110. It talks about what his work's going to be. And then Psalm 47, 93, 96 through 99 all speak of Christ as a universal king over the earth. That king who's going to come and be unlike any other king that's ever lived. The last, we have a few of these classifications, just a couple more to go through. One is the imprecatory psalms. These have imprecation or prayer for retribution judgment to fall on one's enemy. What this basically means is these are the Psalms that talk about where they cry for their enemy to suffer. They cry for their enemy to perish. And some people have problems with these Psalms because these Psalms do not sound biblical. They don't sound like God's typical way. They don't sound like God's loving way. And some people say, well, how can those be biblical? Well, the thing about these Psalms that we got to remember is these Psalms are not Psalms that call for personal revenge, but they call for retribution on God's enemies. When God's enemies and man's enemies line up, then this man cries to God. The psalmist will cry to God to act, not in a way God wasn't going to act anyway, but God would carry out his judgment. And this is an idea that God bring forth your judgment. God bring them back on themselves what they have done. And so that's what these imprecatory psalms are. And these are some psalms that sometimes give us a hard time, but that's the gist of them. They are psalms that are written about justice. And again, it's not personal justice. This is our personal revenge. This is retribution for God. That God will act quicker than he normally would, or quicker than he might act. Then finally you have, or not finally, another psalm, you have Psalms of Ascent or Pilgrim's Praise. These were sung by pilgrims journeying up to Jerusalem. These were sung on the three annual feasts. Remember, 3 times a year the Jews were called to go to Jerusalem for Passover, for Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And Psalm 120 through Psalm 134 typically viewed to be psalms that were sung by these groups as they would get closer to Jerusalem. There were certain songs they would sing. And some of those songs were songs of Zion as well as these songs of ascent. They were songs praising Jerusalem for the city that was as they were looking at that city and as they were marching up the mountain into Jerusalem. The next, I believe this is the last one we've got tonight, are the acrostic psalms. These are psalms in which each verse begins with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. These are listed from you. The most famous of these is Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is most famous because it's the longest psalm, but it's also unique because it has another way of doing acrostic in it. It has 8 verses, all beginning with each letter. So if you've got certain Bibles will do this. If you look at Psalm 119, you'll notice first 8 verses above it will be the words Aleph, A-L-E-P-H. That is the Hebrew A. There'll be Aleph, then there'll be Bet, and then there'll be Gimel, I think it is. And all those verses, verse 1 through 8, all begin with the Hebrew letter A. The next set all begin with B. The next set all with C, and so forth. Now, their alphabet's not exactly like ours, but that's the idea, in that it's unique, and that's what makes it so long. It makes it to be about 160, around 160, 150 verses. So that's our Psalms. I know this is, again, a little deep. The psalm is unlike any others. Last week we talked about Esther and Job, and we broke those down and went chapter by chapter. However, the Psalms, you can't do that. The Psalms are a totally different ballgame. They're a totally different situation. Their Psalms are you have to look at them this way. I know there's a lot to comprehend. I know you may not remember it, but I encourage you, next time you read the Psalms, pay attention. Take this book, take your notes, look for the parallelism. Look and see if you see any parallels in what the psalmist is trying to teach. Is he trying to use contrasting ideas? Is he furthering ideas? Is he repeating it in different words? What is his point? And then try to figure out what the theme of that psalm is. Is it a lament? Is it a praise? Is it thanksgiving? What is it? And that will help you understand. That will help you appreciate it. Because if you try to read a praise psalm the same way you will read a lament psalm, you're going to get lost, and it's not going to make sense. However, if we know what the psalm is, what typical category it's in, what it's trying to accomplish, it opens it up. Because we're going to read again the lament, the imprecatory, and the praise psalms totally different. We're going to read them in totally different manners and totally different ways. But that's all we have for tonight. Next week we will finish up our study of the poetic books, the wisdom literature. We're going to look at Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. We'll look at all 3 of those, and again, they shouldn't take long. Those books are not long. So that'll be our next study for next week. We again appreciate you for tuning in with us tonight. Appreciate you joining us for our class. Again, if you need anything, if you like notes that you don't have yet, we'll say this for the first few weeks. Please contact us. Let us know. We'll gladly send those notes to you. They'll be available on our Facebook page, so if you want to find it there. But for tonight, again, that's all that we have. We appreciate your attention. Appreciate you joining us. We hope that you're having a God-blessed week, and we hope to see you all again real soon. And we will talk to you next time.